everybody. Good morning. And today we are going to continue our discussion of Period 1, starting with Period 1, Topic 2, which is developments of Dar al-Islam. If you don't remember what Dar al-Islam is, that is the Muslim world, right? That is just the House of Islam, right? So everybody who is part of the Muslim world is considered part of Dar al-Islam. So Dar al-Islam is pretty large at this point. Right, it goes all the way from India in the east to Spain in the west. It has gone quite large and quite powerful at this point in 1200, right? Which to kind of reinforce, right, we're looking at the period 1200 to 1450 CE here in this time period, period 1. Okay. One thing they wanted to bring up here at the beginning, which is important, and we didn't necessarily go over in our textbook. Is the kind of the center of scholarship that Islam was, right? Especially the city of Baghdad, right? Baghdad is a very important city for scholarship, right? And especially the building, the kind of university almost. I don't know if it's per se a university. The House of Wisdom. That we see in Baghdad. Okay, I actually have a picture here. Let me flip over to that real quick. Okay, so this is a picture I could find of the House of Wisdom, right? So it was a center for scholarship, a center for learning, right? A center for people of the Muslim world to gather and learn from each other, right? So we start 1200. 1200 is around the time of the Abbasid collapse, right? The first great Muslim Caliphate. And the Abbasid collapse is due to a lot of things, but in particular, what they talked about is 4 different groups that we see invade or take power. One, which is also a new one, is the Mamluk Sultanate. Okay. So Mamluks are enslaved Turks from Central Asia, right? That is what they originally are. They were able to take over Egypt, right? They were able to kind of rise up against the Abbasid leaders there and take over the region of Egypt, right? And one of the things that they were able to do very successfully is focus on trade, especially in sugar and cotton, especially over to Europe from the Muslim world, where sugar and cotton was very plentiful, right? In the Muslim world, in Europe it wasn't too much, and so as being their location in Egypt made it easy for them to trade into Europe through the Mediterranean trade network, right? They do talk about how they will decline due to the Europeans, but we'll get there when we get there, right? The second one that we do know, that we have talked about quite a bit, is the Seljuk Turks. Okay, so the Seljuk Turks, again, another Turkish group, right? So they kind of began their nomadic group from Central Asia, right? And then they start to conquer parts of their neighbors to the Abbasids. And then, so originally they were just kind of peaceful migrations into the Abbasid Caliphate, but over time we start to see them conquer large territories of Central Asia, and then also going into the Abbasid Caliphate itself, right? And so we'll just say they invade from Central Asia and take a large chunk of land from the Abbasids. We're going to leave it at that for right now, though. Third is the Crusaders. Okay, who we'll talk a little bit in a little bit more detail in a later section. Right, they wanted to invade the Holy Land, specifically Jerusalem. Oops, excuse me. Especially Jerusalem, and they take that over. We eventually do see this kind of decline, but not by that time. The Abbasids are kind of out of the picture. And then the fourth and probably most important group is the Mongols, who have their own section later on. They will invade from Central Asia as well. And again, we'll talk about them more later. I guess one thing to add for the the Seljuks is that they essentially displaced the Abbasids in power. They kind of take over almost the same territory, but they kind of keep the Abbasid Caliph as around, but they take the title Sultan, very similar to the Sultanate here, the Mamluks, right? We have two sultanates then, right, which is a kind of Turkish Muslim ruler name. Okay, all right. Another big issue another big reason for their collapse is an economic decline. Okay, so for a large chunk of the Abbasid Caliphate, they had been kind of a center of trade, especially Baghdad, a center of kind of Eurasian trade, Afro-Eurasian trade, really. However, those routes started to shift away from Baghdad and either further north or further south, right? Whether that's along the Silk Road that the Mongols kind of reopened or the Indian Ocean trade routes, right? But we see that the trade routes kind of move away from the Abbasids, which is going to really hurt them economically. And so we start to see Baghdad in particular fall apart during this time period, right? And then we will see it kind of fully collapse, right, with the Mongols in 1258, which is a date I think you need to know. They fully defeat the Abbasids in 1258. Right. Okay, so that's kind of just the end of the Abbasid Caliphate. But what we do want to see is we're going to look at the cultural and social aspects of the Abbasid Caliphate, and as well as the kind of general region that they have here, right? The Abbasid Caliphate itself, right? The culture, the ethnicity, the ethnic makeup of the Abbasids is mostly a mixture of Arab, right, from the Arabian Peninsula, and Persian from modern day Iran. However, as we see them kind of defeated, right, as they're invaded, right, we see later on, we see a lot of different cultures come in, but specifically, we see a lot of Turkic culture make its way into this society, right? And in fact, by the end of this time period, we see three major Turkish empires. We see the Ottomans, which we'll talk about, of course, the Safavids, and the Mughals, right? Yes, right, and the Mughals as kind of our three Turkish empires that kind of take the throne from the Abbasids, right? Despite this multi-ethnic society, right, we still see a cultural unification, right, due to things like Sharia law, right? So Sharia law really heavily unifies the Muslim world, right? Unifies Dar al-Islam, right? And they also have significant universities as well. Universities throughout. They talk about one in Cordoba. They talk about obviously the one in Baghdad. They talk about the one in Cairo, and the Bukhara in Central Asia create lots of intellectual unification, right? And let's talk about some of this love of scholarship, this love of knowledge, right? So we see a few things here. We see as examples, right? They translated Greek texts, right? The texts of Plato and Aristotle. Right. They studied Indian mathematics. Right. And then they got paper making from China. And so there's a lot going on here in the Muslim world technologically during this time period. Right. So some other cultural innovations of this era, because if you guys recall from our last time we talked about the Abbasids, this is the golden age they talk about some specific people, right? One of those being Nasir al-Din al-Tusi, right? Who they talk about as kind of being this almost Renaissance man, right? Astronomy, law, logic, ethics, mathematics, philosophy, medicine. But one of some of the things I want to talk about here is he built an observatory. He studied a lot of trigonometry. He kind of helped make trigonometry a thing by studying the relationship of sides of angles and sides of triangles and their angles, which is great, very fun. And then in general, we also see the development of hospitals and medicine during this time period as well in the Muslim world, right? Which even today is incredibly important. They talk about Ibn Khaldun, who is a kind of founder of historiography, which is how the study of how historians look at history, right? How historians study history. And then the last person they talk about here in this section is a woman, Aisha al-Bayunya. I know I am. Let me start that over a little bit. Bayunya, maybe. Okay. So she is a female Sufi poet, right? She has a long poem about Muhammad, kind of showing her knowledge, her learning, and then kind of just focusing on mystical illumination, right? So Nasir al-Din al-Tusi, Ibn Khaldun, Aisha al-Bayunya. So those are kind of three important people to know from this era. And from Aisha, we see kind of this this contrast between Muslims and Sufi Muslims, right? We see kind of the general Muslim population focuses on intellectual pursuits, right? They're very concerned with learning, which Muhammad really pushed for them as well, right? To learn as much as they can. While as the Sufis are more focused on introspection, right? Kind of almost meditative in a way, right? That they also were kind of anti-luxury and also very culturally fluid, right? They would kind of roll into whatever culture that they were in, right? They wouldn't necessarily force the ideas of Islam upon them, right? Which also helped them make them kind of the most effective missionaries of Islam over time. Because their cultural fluidity, right? Their ability to kind of tell everybody, like, hey, you can worship Allah however you want, right? And then even sometimes, right, they would blend local cultures with the ideas of Islam as well, right? Okay. So now we're going to talk a little bit about trade, right, and kind of its role in society. So merchants are highly regarded in Muslim society, which is a stark contrast to Chinese society, right? Chinese society and Confucian societies, so a lot of East Asia merchants are not highly regarded because they're not considered to produce anything. But merchants are very highly regarded in Islam because Muhammad himself was a merchant. His first wife was a merchant, and trade really helped the Muslim caliphates grow, right? And so, and especially with the revival of the Silk Roads and the Indian Ocean Trade Network, right? And revival of the Silk Roads and the growth of the Indian Ocean trade, right? That made them very, can make them a lot of money, can make them very wealthy, can make them very powerful, right? So they were quite well liked in society as long as they, kind of kept to Islam as well, right? So that's just kind of a unique aspect of their society. Okay. Now we do see as Islam colonizes and controls new areas like North Africa, parts of Sub-Saharan Africa, parts of Spain, right? We do see some discrimination against non-Arabs, right? But not to the point of persecution. But what we do see, especially early on, is that the Arabs kind of get, just like the Arab Muslims, even compared to non-Arab Muslims, tend to get a lot more benefits, right, from their society, right, whether it's political or economic, right. We do see that discrimination fall away as the Abbasids kind of grow and become more powerful and larger, right. So we do see. So I would say, while there's some discrimination, I think the key thing is there's mostly tolerance of other cultures and especially other religions, as long as you must pay the tax, the jizya, right, the tax against non-believers, right. In terms of slavery within their kind of cultural social structure, slaves can't be Muslim, really can't be any people of the book, right? Christians and Jews, right, in particular. And so where we do see them come from is mostly places like sub-Saharan Africa, as well as Russia. So we see them come from Africa. We see from what we call the Kievan Rus, which is Russia, and the Ukraine, and then Central Asia. Right. But however, we do see kind of a better treatment of slaves here than we tend to see in other places, right? They could convert to Islam, which was, pretty important, and then could be freed if they did so. Not necessarily freed. It's kind of up to the slave owner, right? But a lot of times we do see that happen. We see slave women actually have a few more freedoms than non-slave women. They could kind of move around as they please, right? They could run errands. They could go to the markets. They could dance or perform musically. And so that could even get them their freedom as well, right? So, speaking of kind of women overall within Muslim society, right? Free women in particular, right? We have a couple things we want to talk about here, right? So one of the key things, obviously, is the role of the hijab in Muslim society, which can mean one of two things. It can either refer to the general notion of kind of dressing modestly or a specific type of covering. So that is kind of like the symbol a lot of people tend to take away from, the role of women in Muslim society. But comparatively speaking to other religions of this time, especially religions of the book, we see women have more freedoms than other religions during this time period, right? So some of the examples they bring up, right, is they could study. They just couldn't study with men, right? He especially through the kind of the teachings of Muhammad and the way that Muhammad treated women within his own life, right? So dowries are paid to the wife, not to the wife's family, right? Which is a huge deal. There is no female infanticide. Again, another huge deal, right? He kind of forbade this practice, right? And then the kind of key example that we see in Muhammad's life is that his own wife was educated. His first wife was very well educated, had her own business, which kind of showed that women, could be powerful in this society, right? They could, so generally speaking, they could inherit property. Okay. They could retain ownership of property after marriage. They could remarry if widowed. They could remarry if widowed, and they could get they could receive kind of they could receive money if they were divorced, right? They could practice birth control. They could testify in court, which was only half of a testimony. of a man, but they could still do it, whereas in a lot of other societies they could not, right? Yeah, this is a lot of rights that we don't see women have in other societies, right? Um, However, as we see kind of the growth of urbanization, we see kind of the restriction of women's rights. Mostly because what happens with urban areas, especially compared to rural areas, right? In rural areas, you need women to help work for the family, right? The family needs everybody to work, and so you see kind of quite a bit of rights for women. However, with urbanization, you don't have that need, that demand to make sure women are working, so that leads to a lot of restrictions on their life. So that tends to lead to kind of restrictions on their life. And the key, the kind of symbolism that we see for the new status of women is the veil, all right, which kind of goes along with the hijab kind of concept, and the harem, right? The harem being the dwelling, the living set aside for wives and concubines of a man and the children of those concubines and wives, right? So on the whole, it's better than most places, but it's still not great, right? At least in our kind of presentist view, you know. So let's kind of end our discussion today about Islam in Spain. The Islam in Spain is very important because it is a cultural mix that's going to be very unique and very, very different and very important going forward, right? They had their capital as Cordoba, right? And a lot of times what you see this kind of caliphate called is the Caliphate of Cordoba. You also see it called Al-Andalus, right? Which I think is what I would like to refer to it as. Right. So they conquer Spain from Africa and they start to invade, and they actually push forth into the rest of Europe. And in particular, they do invade France, right, where they are defeated by a man by the name of Charles Martel. They're defeated at the Battle of Tours. Right, and this battle kind of ends Islam trying to push outside of Spain within Europe. Right, this halts the European expansion of Islam, but it does. They still have control over Spain. Right, right. We see a heavy tolerant climate of toleration within Spain. Toleration of other religions, especially Christianity and Judaism, right? Which makes sense because they're kind of going into an area, right, that is heavily there, heavily Christian and Jewish. They traded with China. They brought trade from China here, where a lot of Europeans didn't necessarily do that, which allowed these Chinese goods and these Southeast Asian goods like spices, silk, and porcelain to make their way into Europe. And this is really the only way they're getting into Europe, right? And these ships that they used to transport these on are known as the dhows or jows. I don't know how exactly to pronounce it. But the dhows were the ships that were able to kind of get these goods over from the Mediterranean, through the Red Sea, through the Indian Ocean, right? They were trade goods or trade ships, not necessarily ships made for warfare, right? Cordoba becomes a center of learning, especially in between the Jews, Christians, and Muslims, right, in the region. So it had the largest library in the world at the time, and one of the most famous scholars there is Ibn Rushd, right? So our fourth kind of thinker here. He's also known as Averroes, right? But one of his key things was he was just a writer about law, about philosophy, especially. He was kind of a very there was a big philosophical tension in the Islamic world at the time between the role of Muhammad and these philosophies. And Ibn Rushd was more on the side of not putting Muhammad into philosophy, right? So we see kind of this the key one of the key things that comes out of Ibn Rushd, and also not only just Ibn Rushd, but the kind of blend of Jewish, Christian, and Muslim culture in this region. Blend of Christian, Jewish, and Muslim culture. Right. One of the key things that comes out of here is the relearning of Aristotle in Europe, right? So what we see, they kind of talked about this three-step system of Ibn Rushd to this Jewish philosopher Maimonides, and the Maimonides influencing St. Thomas Aquinas, right? Right, and so what we really see is that this kind of center of learning here sets the groundwork, lays the table for the Renaissance and the scientific revolution in Europe, right? Because not really having access to these things would have prevented them from necessarily learning about those things, especially in the terms of papermaking, right? Which came out of Spain for Europe, right? Of course, it came from China, but it kind of spread its way through the world, right? And so that's going to do it for this section 1.2, the developments in Dar al-Islam. A lot of cultural and social stuff. Not necessarily a lot of big political changes, especially because we're kind of already quickly coming upon a time where the Abbasid Caliphate is going to fall away and decline at the hands of the Mongols, and they already really have at the hands of the Seljuk Turks. So not a lot of key. So I think this one's going to be kind of tough to remember some of this stuff, especially because, at least for us, since we were using a different textbook, some of this is quite new, right? But go ahead and try to memorize this, try to remember all this stuff, and that'll do it for the next time. We will talk about South and Southeast Asia during the post-classical period, and I will see you guys later.